Hello, welcome to today's AT&T Cyber Threat Report. This is September 22nd, 2011. Joining us today, we have John Hogoboom. John is a recognized security expert, analyst, as well as a tool developer. Welcome, John. And what do you plan to discuss today?
Hey, Brian. We're going to talk about a couple of malware campaigns that we've seen recently, one related to Skype and another one related to some interesting file naming conventions that they're using to trick people, and we'll explain more about that as we go along.
All right. I've seen a little bit of that. It sounds like an interesting topic. We have a guest here today, Patrick McCanna. Patrick is a key member of our mobility threat awareness and response team. Patrick, you've joined us a couple of times in the past. Welcome back. What do you plan to discuss today?
Today I'm going to talk about basic security applied to mobility. We're going to talk about what it takes to scan handsets, and enterprises that are thinking about traditional network scanning activities that they do for their PCs today. They don't work if you scan them against handsets. And so we'll talk about why they don't work, what it would look like for an attacker to scan a handset, and how enterprises would be able to audit their handsets for security compliance.
That sounds like some good information. I think that is one of the transitions that needs to take place, that is in IT environments, learning what is different about the mobility environment in comparison to the traditional wireline environment. So sounds like a good discussion. I'm Brian Rexroad, and I'll cover the Internet Weather Report today. And if you have feedback, questions, or would like to suggest some topics that we should address, you can reach us. Our email address is cyberthreat@list.att.com. So let's talk a little bit about this new malware, John. What do you have?
All right. Thanks, Brian. So the first one we have is, this is not really anything amazing, although it's a new tactic. So we've talked before about fake antivirus campaigns that go out there where they try to trick you into downloading, or trick you into thinking that your machine's infected. Once you click a link, they install some malware in your machine, but it's somewhat convincing-looking fake antivirus, and they try to charge you for it. It doesn't really detect anything, or very minimally. In any event, there's a new campaign that's going out, and I thought it was a little interesting twist in that they're using Skype, and there's a particular Skype user, I forget what the exact name of it was, but some kind of automated agent or something like that, and it will actually call people, and it plays a voice message to them that says, you've been infected. Actually, the message is right in here. This is an automated computer system alert. Your computer protection service is not active. To activate computer protection and repair a computer, go to such and such a link. So it's kind of interesting. This is kind of a vishing, voice kind of phishing type of attack, and I don't know that we've seen it before with Skype. We've seen it with other types of things, such as cell phones and other traditional things. I just thought it was an interesting tactic. I believe Skype has responded to this pretty quickly and taken it offline, from what I understand. Just an interesting one.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think, obviously Skype has become very popular, particularly for people that are corresponding with, friends, family overseas and things. So it's clearly it's become something that's not just the techies that are using Skype. It's the, common users today. In fact, I think my mom has actually been enticing me to use Skype. So it's good to be aware of these sorts of things.
Yep.
Now, are these actual messages that are coming in over Skype?
Yeah, it's an actual voice message. So
okay.
It tries to call you like a regular Skype user would, and then it plays an automated message, a canned voice message to you.
That's interesting. For years there's been a lot of Skype spam that's of many, many different types of content. I've never heard of actual voice spam coming over Skype at this point, so that's novel to me.
Right. That's kind of why I wanted to take a look at it and just mention it to people in case they get a weird phone call on their Skype such as that. The next one we had, this one's a little bit more tricky. We get a lot of spam that we monitor as well, and somebody, ComTouch Cafe, was one of the first people to report this. This is not a new technique per se in malware delivery or a malware trickery, but it is picked up steam considerably in the past few weeks here, kind of middle of August until middle of September here that we're in. And basically what it is they're using a trick called right-to-left override in file names. And what they do is midway through a file name, they'll actually insert a special character that tells the operating system, Windows, that the rest of this file name should be displayed in right-to-left fashion, such as Arabic or other languages that are read from right to left. So when you actually look at the file name, it reverses that tail end of it such that it can trick you into thinking it's a file extension that it's not. So I have an example here in the slides of one that we actually received. First off, I should mention we've seen a couple of different campaigns of this. FedEx, UPS, there's another one called Map of Love where I forget exactly what they were purporting in that one. This one is actually Xerox. So it looks like it comes in as a potential scan that maybe you scanned on a Xerox photocopier or something, and they attached it to the email here. And you'll see there's an attachment here for Xerox scan, and it has a date in it. A lot of the ones we've actually seen have some kind of date in the middle of the name, so that's something to keep an eye out for as well. But as always, if you're receiving emails from people you don't know with attachments, don't open them. But that being said, let's continue along. So if you did actually sorry, Brian.
I just wanted to make sure that it's clear that even though we are seeing these with FedEx and Xerox and UPS associated with those, they're not associated with those companies at all. They're fraudulent. Is that correct?
Right. That's exactly right. They're fraudulent. I should have clarified that. Thank you. So if we were actually to open the zip file up, what we see inside the zip file is a file name, and I kind of expanded it here in the bottom. The file name looks like it's Xerox scan with a date in here and some underbars, collexe.doc. So if I were to look at this as the general, average user, even myself, I would say, oh, it's a WinWord document. I expect it's going to open in Microsoft Word or whatever kind of viewer I'm using for .doc files. And in reality, though, WinZip is actually honoring this right-to-left override bit. And it's actually a Unicode character. They stuffed in the middle of this right in here, in between the COLL and the EXE, there's a bit you can't see. And it becomes a little more apparent on the next slide. If you actually drop it onto your desktop on at least Windows XP, Windows 7 actually shows it in the same file name, which is a little scary. So you can even be tricked in Windows 7. Hopefully you can see this, but you'll see in reality it's not collexe.doc. It's call, and then there's this Unicode character in here, and it's really the file name is cod.exe. So what they did is they took the exe or the cod.exe, told it to reverse whatever you see by using this Unicode instruction here. So it looks like a .doc when you view it, but in reality, if you double-click it, it's an executable. What we've seen, this is not new. This was kind of reported about a year ago, but it really didn't pick up steam until, like I said, a few weeks ago or so. So be on the eye out for it. It actually does have an icon here that looks like it, so it's got an embedded icon in the executable to make it look like it's a Word document, another little bit of trickery. What we've actually seen is if you run this, all the ones we've seen are very small executables. They're mostly what we call Trojan downloaders. So they're going to go download a second-hand component that's larger to really do the malware piece of work, put you part of whatever botnet. Some of the samples have been Bradle Lab. Some have been other types. You got something to say, Brian?
Oh, I was just going to say, I assume that in order to understand more specifically what this malware will be doing on the computer, it requires, a further understanding that is after the downloader gets used for some other download activity. Right.
And we've done some analysis, and it's most of the ones we've tried have been quickly shut down, so it hasn't been able to retrieve its second payload. And that's all I really have on that one. I just wanted to give some people the common things we've been seeing lately to keep an eye out for.
Does this display this way on the most up-to-date version of 7?
The way we're seeing on the screen here, I've seen on Windows 7 it does not. It displays it in the honoring the RLO bit, showing it as a .doc file.
Okay.
When you look at it,
have you looked at it on the Mac OS?
I have not.
Okay.
Although on a Mac it wouldn't really execute anyway.
Oh, excellent point. unless you're in a VMware image. But yeah, very, very good. And I also got to mention that exe spelled right to left is exe. But
yes, I know. Part of the joke in their article there.
All right, very good. Thank you, John. That's some good insight there. Next item here, Patrick, you were going to talk a little bit about scanning mobile devices and how to do it the right way.
Yeah, so if you think about an attacker's perspective, in general, if we put our black hats on and we're going to start scanning the internet to try to find victims, we might take giant swaths of IP addresses and looking for vulnerable nodes or nodes with characteristics that we're familiar with via a tool called Nmap. And you might think, enterprises today that are kind of forward-leaning will regularly scan all of the nodes in their enterprise to try to discover vulnerabilities before bad guys do. And so you might be used to using this tool on your desktop machines and your server machines, and you might be thinking about how you might apply those to mobile devices. Well, what's interesting is that the rules don't really apply the same for mobile devices. There are many, many caveats here, but I'm going to talk about the general mobile subscriber and why Nmap scanning against a handset does not really work the way people might expect, and how enterprises might be able to do enterprise auditing for handsets if they decided they wanted to take this degree of assessment in place.
Now, one thing that to consider here is that because of the difference, in some respects, there is actually a little bit of a protection mechanism as well. Is that right?
I would take that perspective, absolutely. I think that will become clear here in the general case very shortly. At the same time, there's a lot of obfuscation, and so someday, depending on how the network evolves, things may change significantly as the obfuscation decreases and IPv6 starts coming online, and there are no IP address exhaustion issues that are protecting handset subscribers. So for starters, the most important thing I think people should be aware of is a handset is basically a dual-homed node at any given time if it supports Wi-Fi. So if you're used to thinking of computers that have multiple NICs and connections to multiple routers or multiple networks and what that might mean, a handset basically functions in a very similar fashion. The mobile network interface, the interface that faces our towers, is in GSM nomenclature referred to as the interface. And the Wi-Fi interface is pretty easy to understand. It's the 802.11 radio that you might be able to interact with via a Wi-Fi hotspot. The Wi-Fi hotspot interface is going to expose different ports than what are exposed on the interface. So if you decide to run Nmap in a Wi-Fi network against like an Android device or an iPhone device, you may see ports open, and there may be some things you might think you can derive from that. But you should be aware that when that subscriber is moving around on the mobile network, those interfaces are not necessarily directly exposed. And in some cases, there are actually other services that are exposed on the interface that aren't on the Wi-Fi interface. So if you think about applying Nmap to a handset, the only way that you can really do this is over Wi-Fi. You might think of clever ways to derive the IP address for a handset. Some handsets expose the IP address via the interface, and so you might try to run Nmap against that interface. But you're actually going to be scanning against a NAT router, or you'll find that that's private address space that you can't reach. You might think, well, I'll have this handset connect to a web server where I can view the logs and I can derive the IP address that the handset used. Well, again, if you're going to be scanning the IP address that you're hitting there, you're not actually hitting the handset, you're hitting a NAT router. And so I've got a little diagram here that kind of demonstrates really the differences here. So in your Wi-Fi hotspot scenario, obviously you've got a firewall because we're all security conscious. You've got a Wi-Fi router, and you've got a handset. So you might have a laptop over here. You definitely can get routing from the Wi-Fi router to the handset. But if you're going to go over a 3G network, what you're going to find is, well, I might have a 10 dot address over here. I might be able to get that directly from the handset. But obviously, I'm not going to be able to route from a 10 dot address over here because of private address space rules. Again, if I look at the IP address that's in my server log, I might have some, x.y.z address. But what that's associated with is the NAT router. And so any scanning you're doing is actually against our network infrastructure, which is a really bad idea. I would strongly encourage people not to do that unless you want to end up in our intrusion attempt logs. So these are not hard and fast rules. If you have a custom connectivity solution, this is a very, very advanced connection that's exclusively oriented around enterprises and mobile application service providers. You can do things to change how routing works. But for most subscribers, they end up getting null routed at the NAT router. So what does this mean? For starters, attackers trying to discover handsets, it's much more challenging to use Nmap methods. To do any kind of discovery will require victim interaction. So I have to somehow phish my victim, get them to view a web application, or convince them to install a mobile application. Enumerating services on the mobile device. So usually you run Nmap and you see, I got port 22 open, port 80 open, et cetera. Obviously, Nmap is not going to be in play here. You generally cannot do that with a mobile or a web application. So if you want to enumerate the services on a handset, you're going to have an application installed on the handset. And additionally, different different operating systems have different security models. So you may write a mobile application that tries to enumerate the handset, but it will fail to do so because it won't have the appropriate privileges to be able to enumerate the handset in a comprehensive fashion.
Okay. Now, Patrick, I have a couple of questions here.
Okay.
First of all, you've been using the term handset, but I assume this would also apply in a scenario where somebody has a conventional computer with an air card connected to the mobility network. Would that be correct?
Generally speaking, yes. The caveat being you could have a custom connectivity solution where you have custom routing and the enterprise makes a mistake. But generally speaking, you would not be able to route to the computer.
And the other thing I was wondering about is, IPv6 is coming along. Any conjecture or any idea what how this might change in time?
I will not make explicit statements about our current planning. There's a lot of discussion about IPv6 and how this will revolutionize mobile addressing. The idea is that everyone will get a publicly routable IPv6 address. I don't see that happening anytime soon, and there will be if that transaction happens, if that change does happen, this security model completely changes. But for the time being, I'm not sure that we're going to be looking at a significant change in how routing works. Most routing needs to be originated by the handset.
Right, and so I think that's an important thing to consider because, as you said, there has been a lot of discussion about the IPv6 and how that would perhaps break loose the requirement for natting, but for the foreseeable future, this is a good thing from a security standpoint, perhaps a bit of a challenge for doing security scanning if that's an important part of your program, and some good considerations here. Thank you.
Hey, Patrick, I got one question for you about this. If you had a laptop with a 3G card and it gets a 10. address, could I run Nmap on my laptop and hit the handsets that are on the 3G network?
It's a great question.
Addresses?
It's a great question. That would be a violation of terms and conditions if you tried. Okay. But if you tried, you would find that it wouldn't work because we don't have that kind of routing enabled. Once again, caveat being in a custom connectivity solution, an enterprise could make a mistake and allow routing between handsets, or could make a design decision to do that where they're having measured risk. In general, that would that's a very limited number of devices that would be on that APN, and it's a controlled environment. But absolutely, the subscriber cannot scan other subscribers by default.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thanks.
So just in conclusion, so if you are an enterprise and you're looking at how to audit mobile devices and you've used Nmap in the past to do this, you really are going to need to evolve to alternative methods. There are mobile device management solutions. You can use Exchange to be able to do some kind of logging and monitoring of what devices are connecting to your infrastructure. But Nmap in general is not going to be an effective method for determining vulnerabilities against handsets. And it's also not going to tell you about the exposure that the devices have while they're roaming out on our network.
Okay.
With that, hand it back to you, Brian.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. And next segment here, we'll go to the Internet Weather Report. Okay, so for the last 7 days here, I would describe it as a not particularly outstanding week in terms of no significant security revelations have taken place. Most of the things that we have here we've reported on the past. We do have one, what I would call a subtle development related to the Morto worm. This is associated with port 3389. That there is still some activity around that here, and we'll get into that in a moment. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. We have 5631 TCP that's still active in scanning activity. We'll take a quick look at that. We've been reporting for about 2 months now the activity on port 23, and that is associated with activity on port 22. This is the worm activity we're seeing predominantly in Korea. A couple of little things that we'll point out here. I don't think it's a big security issue, but there is some, what I describe as unknown activity, scanning activity on port 65533. And one thing that we probably have not reported in these reports over the last 20 or so episodes is we do see a bit of a surge in scanning activity on port 1434. That's associated with Microsoft SQL Server, and we'll take a look at that. It's not a big event, not particularly unusual, but something at least worth taking a look at. So with that, let's jump in, take a look at this 5631 activity. As I said, we've reported this over the last, I think, about 3 weeks now. This is associated with the Symantec PCANYWHERE. Most of the probes are basically from one source address in the China region. And all of these probes, in fact, are coming from really a handful of sources that are also from China. So this is, you know, there is a bit of a bias here, so to speak. And there are some isolated indications of successful connections here. That is, it does appear that some of the targeted addresses here are making connections, and so there may be some perhaps password guessing or some sort of exploit activity taking place here. So certainly if you have PCANYWHERE in use, or if you suspect that there might be some non-authorized use in your enterprise, you want to take a look at that.
So, hey, Brian, I got a question about that, and I haven't done this analysis, but is there PCANYWHERE and Remote Desktop Protocol are very similar, identical functionalities. Is there any overlap here between the patterns and times of this scanning and the Morto worm activity? I know Morto does not scan for PCANYWHERE, but it almost looks like there might be some correlation of times and gaps of times.
My particular personal assessment here is I think this is just another area where password guessing activity is being used to try to gain access, basically trying to exploit pretty much any remote access tool that's available, whether it be an administrative port on databases or whether it be Telnet or SSH. RDP being an example, we've seen a lot of that activity. There does seem to be some relationship between the addresses that are doing this targeted activity, which is very distinct from a worm that's propagating around the network and has a diverse set of sources that are doing that scanning. So there are some clear patterns here. That is, there's groups of addresses that are doing some what I would describe as aggressive scanning, not associated with worm activity. Generally, it looks like it's associated with password guessing activity to gain remote access one way or another.
All right. Okay, good point. Thanks.
And this is sort of a contrasting or scenario here where we're seeing port 23. This, as I mentioned earlier, we'll take a look at port 22 in a moment here, which has a very similar profile. This is, again, scanning activity. It is associated with some sort of infection that had taken place. We're still at the point where we're seeing on the order of about 3,000 sources that are scanning in certain hours of the day. About 87% of those sources come from one provider in Korea. So as we had said in many times previous segments, it looks like this scanning activity is associated with some type of misconfiguration or something that allowed systems to be infected with this worm, and a good portion of it has been remediated, but some of it is still continuing.
So, Brian, they're succeeding in finding nodes on the Internet that are exposing Telnet.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's less success now. When we first saw this activity pick up in about the third week in July, there was actually a very significant amount of success, where we went from where we typically saw on the order of about maybe 1,000 sources scanning on a given hour. It went up to about 14,000 or so sources that were scanning in a given hour.
Any insight into why Telnet is running on systems that are Internet-facing in 2011?
Well, you're trying to get me on a soapbox here. This baffles me. We've looked at this, and the password guessing attacks are not all that particularly sophisticated, and yet these are successful. Clearly, this looks like some sort of a configuration error that occurred that caused this to be successful. And as I'll point out here, SSH is also being targeted here. So this is a matter of not the fact that Telnet is being used perhaps as much as perhaps not good enough passwords. And all things being equal, if we look at this, we identified on the order of 15,000 sources that were, confirmed to be infected here, or at least highly good evidence that they were infected. In the scope of the Internet, that is not a huge, huge number. This is not a really widespread infection, pretty much isolated to a particular environment, and it's good to see that some remediation activity has been taking place. And again, as I said, related to this, there's a strong time correlation with activity associated with port 22. We've also been able to show that the sources that are doing the scanning on port 23 are also scanning on port 22. So you can see that activity here as well. Again, sources are basically the same set of sources that are scanning on port 23. There may, in fact, be other ports that are being probed associated with this, but more readily visible in our analysis are these two. The next one is basically a revisit. We've been reporting on the mortar worm, I think, since about mid-August now. The news about the malware itself that was associated with this came out on August 28th. And since then, the activity has sort of been on and off. And the indications are, it seems that the operator of this worm, the botnet that's associated with it, appears to have deliberately turned it off, perhaps to let the media coverage settle. They've been on and off since then. As you can see, they're basically on and off segments. And most recently, what has happened is we've seen now some new scanning activity that's taking place that's continuing, but at a lower level. And there was actually an update, actually a couple of blogs that were posted by Symantec, one more recently that indicated that the scanning function that is scanning on port 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, had basically been turned off, as well as a command and control function associated with DNS. And so that's basically where it stands right now. It appears that some of the devices, or the infected devices, have been updated with that sort of new configuration, but others appear to still be in scanning mode here. I don't know, John, did you have any other insights or comments on this?
No, I don't have any particular insights, although I found it interesting that as soon as Microsoft announced their findings on August 28th there, it made that dramatic decline that it did, which I believe is in part due to the fact that the command and control was shut down, and possibly that they might have added some signatures into their tools. I guess one of the things that's interesting to me, though, is, you mentioned that the RDP 3389 TCP scanning is no longer in there, but that was really its method of propagation for replication and, obtaining new victim machines and whatnot. So I'm wondering if they've decided, okay, we did what we did already here, and we're going to move on to some other method for replicating in a non-worm-like fashion, like more traditional botnets do, either be spam or whatever, some other means.
Yeah, there's a good possibility. My impression here is that they've actually segmented this botnet into basically a recruitment group, and so they're still recruiting new devices, but at a lower level than previously. And in the meantime, they've basically turned off the recruiting activity for a portion of it, and they're perhaps using it for something else. There were some indications in this blog that they were doing something on a gaming site, a popular Chinese gaming site. I'm not sure exactly what the nature of that activity was or why that's being done, but certainly this is not a threat that's completely gone away. Next item here is I don't have a clear motive associated with this, but it is scan probing activity on port 65533. It's basically a single source that's doing this, so I wouldn't consider it to be any sort of a widespread threat. I haven't really found any applications that are clearly associated with that particular port. I did find that there is some relationship with scanning activity on port 27,777 TCP as well. At different times, these two ports are being scanned, but it turns out the source of that scanning is the same source. So there's some sort of correlation here, but again, not clear what the motivation is. If you have some information or some insight into this, please let us know. And last but not least, this is actually kind of a revisit from an old foe, I would say. This is scanning activity, basically a surge in scanning activity that we're seeing on port 1434 UDP. That port is recognized mostly as it's used for the Microsoft SQL Monitor that's a part of Microsoft SQL database. And in this particular case, the scanning activity, this is a sort of a traditional thing here in a sense, it has the characteristics of a SQL slammer infection. That is, one of the characteristics of this particular worm was that it was very efficient in terms of being able to propagate. It was a 404-byte packet, and these, in fact, do show that characteristics of the 444 bytes. That was the entire payload that was able to get enough executable so that it was able to infect the database and cause it to propagate further. And I should point out as well that about 75% of the probes that are associated with this come from just a few source addresses in China. So really what we're talking about is this increase in activity. It went down from a noise floor of what we call, I would say about 250,000 probes per hour that we had been seeing. It's gone up to about 4 million probes per hour. This is not a terribly unusual event, but it's certainly one that you want to pay attention to. Certainly if you're running Microsoft SQL Server, you'll want to pay attention to that.
So Brian, is it true that it's that we've got people that are exposing SQL Monitor to the Internet in 2011? No, I'm just kidding. My real question is there a possibility that this is associated with Microsoft? They have a desktop SQL Server deployment. It's not a full-blown SQL deployment. I think it's MSDE, Microsoft SQL Desktop Environment. And I'm wondering if maybe that is by default sharing information out there, and that may be why that's floating around?
I'm not. That's a good question, Patrick. I don't have a really good insight into what the profile is on the Internet in terms of exposure of this and exactly what applications. That was one of the issues that existed with the original SQL Slammer worm, in that there were workstations that had a sort of a lighter version of this that could be exposed. I think there was even some sort of association with Visio or something along those lines, if I recall correctly. And so I think the real thing to consider here is that in the real world, although we tend to think about security and everybody's sort of aware of the primary security concerns, it's a big world that we live in here. It's a large Internet, and there are no licensing requirements for putting something onto the Internet. And so long as there are stupid mistakes being made, there are others that are motivated to find those stupid mistakes and take advantage of it.
Yeah, I mean, and this is just a theory, but there are packages out there that make it very easy for application developers to bundle the SQL desktop environment onto their application. So if you got, some kind of advanced database functionality on the back end of a cool little desktop application, you might not even know that this is sitting on your system. And if the developer makes some mistakes, you might have these ports sitting open.
That's absolutely true. And this is a case where I don't think that there's actually propagation going on. I don't think this is the traditional Microsoft SQL slammer worm in the sense that it actually infects and then continues to propagate, although that's certainly a possibility. I think that this has been adjusted a little bit so that it doesn't do the propagation so much. It's more just to infect the machine, use the same exploit, and gain access to the machine. So a minor adjustment of what was the original Microsoft SQL slammer worm. And so that's one of the things to sort of keep in mind. That is, in the SQL slammer, one of the problems, because it was such an aggressive scanner, it would load down the machine and load down the network. This is one that might be a little more subtle in its impact. Good point. Thank you.
The 2011 point is my favorite one.
Yeah. And then here we are with the basically the summary of activity that's been taking place over the last week. That is, these are the top 10 most probed ports. A lot of these we've talked about. 1433, again, SQL Server, but this would be one that's probably targeting password guessing activities as opposed to that older exploit. Port 445 is still the most probed, associated with configure worm, as well as weak file shares that might be exposed on the internet. We talked about port 22. We talked about port 23 associated with that. We talked about port 3389. There's still old file sharing tools out there that are subject to exploits on port 135. And we are still seeing a reasonable amount of activity probing for port 8909. That's basically digging around for anonymous proxies. Web servers are always a target. We talked about the PCANYWHERE. And there's also sort of an old friend here, port 5900, which is virtual network computing, yet another one of these remote access tools that's similar to RDP as well as PCANYWHERE, basically providing access to a Windows desktop. And that is also being targeted for password guessing. There have been some exploits against software in that application in the past, so also one that needs to be kept up to date. So with that, I think that concludes our program for today. Again, if you have questions, feedback, or suggestions, drop us a line at cyberthreat@list.att.com. You can reach this program on the AT&T Tech Channel. That's techchannel.att.com. It's available as a podcast as well as on YouTube. Just search for AT&T Cyber Threat Report. And thank you, John. Thank you, Patrick. And until next time, stay safe.